Welcome back from the break. Now, the President of the United States has now said that talks with Iran could happen within the next 2 days and that they are now more than likely to happen in Islamabad. Of course, earlier in the show, we've already heard details about that famous phone call. This is how that phone call was reported by the New York Post, whose reporter was just with us. It says additional US-Iran peace talks could be happening over the next 2 days in Pakistan. Pakistan's capital, the president said in an initial phone interview, Trump had claimed that discussions were happening, but a little bit slow. So clearly things have happened and they have changed very rapidly. Now, just think about that. They're going to happen in Islamabad if they happen. Again, not Europe, not any other venue, Islamabad. And Trump didn't just say this casually. He said it while praising Pakistan's role and making it clear that the center of gravity in this diplomacy has indeed shifted.
I think it was the first time that you'd ever seen the Iranian government, the U.S. government meet at such a high level, maybe in the history of the current leadership of Iran. So that's, I think, a positive. And again, we did make some progress in the negotiation. The big question from here on out is whether the Iranians will have enough flexibility, whether the Iranians will accept the critical things that we need to see in order for things to get done.
Now hold that thought, because at the exact same time, the US has launched a naval blockade targeting Iranian ports through the Straits of Hormuz. So, on one track, diplomats are preparing to talk. On another, warships are already in motion. And that is the real contradiction that I have been talking about repeatedly. If talks are that close, why do you need to escalate? And if escalation is necessary, why are the talks picking up again? That's the question at the center of everything. Now, before we go further, we need to understand what is actually being negotiated, because this is not vague diplomacy. This is hard bargaining. And at the core of this entire crisis is the sanctions regime. Decades of layered pressure, from asset freezes to energy restrictions to financial isolation, and most importantly, secondary sanctions that force the entire world to comply. So when Iran talks about relief and the US talks about leverage, this is what they mean. And let's talk about what they mean. Currently, there are two kinds of sanctions on Iran, the primary and secondary sanctions, which are going to become part of the negotiations whenever they happen, hopefully in Islamabad. Primary ones apply only to the US persons and entities, enforced by Office of the Foreign Assets Control, and they prohibit trade, financial transactions, and investment. The secondary ones apply globally to non-US actors. Penalty, loss of access to US financial system, and the effect is forces international compliance with US policy. So this is essentially how the sanctions look like, and they are going to become extremely relevant in the coming days. And now, since we're talking about the coming days, let's just add the latest developments. Vice President of the US, J.D. Vance, says there was progress in Pakistan. Iran says Pakistan is relaying messages between Tehran and Washington. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif is now traveling across to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. And a 4-country coordination meeting, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, has already taken place in Islamabad. Now, here's the route. Prime Minister has already left. He has gone from Islamabad to Riyadh, which is going to be really crucial because Saudi Arabia is now playing a central role in terms of how the negotiations actually shape up and what happens in the coming days. From there, he's going to go to Doha, Qatar. Qatar, of course, has been saying the right kind of things. They have also welcomed Pakistani mediation. So this will be very, very important. And then, of course, to Turkey, where Pakistan has real close diplomacy, and Turkey is also playing a very important role.
When it comes to the talks in Islamabad, we remain, in contact with our brothers in Pakistan who are leading this mediation. As you have seen, there has been a lot of calls and prospective visits from Pakistani officials and with the Qatari officials, and all of this is within this kind of coordination that the whole region actually is engaging with Pakistan. We applaud the efforts of Pakistan. We support their efforts.
It is absolutely clear that this is not routine diplomacy. This is momentum. And that is the key point tonight. Momentum is building towards another round. But this round cannot be symbolic. It has to deal with substance. Because one of these issues is money, real money, tens of billions of dollars in Iranian assets that are held abroad. But here's the catch. These are not freely usable funds. They are restricted, controlled, and politically conditional. So the question is not just how much, but how and when access to these funds is given. Now, let's come back to the blockade. One thing is very clear. A naval blockade is not pressure. It is actually an act of war. And Iran has responded accordingly with warnings of retaliation and escalation. China has now openly criticized the blockade, calling it dangerous and irresponsible. This is the extremely significant statement from the Chinese president. Says we must not allow the world to revert to the law of the jungle. Now clearly, without naming Trump and America, he is referring to what the American president is doing. The Chinese president saying all this means that China is now extremely concerned about the way things are going, and he has also given this 4-point peace plan, which says peaceful existence and regional security architecture, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, uphold international law, balance development with security. So you can see how the role that the United States used to play as a global stabilizer, that role this man is now actually playing, and things have completely changed in the way that the world is being run. So, bottom line, this is not just about US and Iran. This is becoming a broader geopolitical contest in so many words, and therefore, again, another reason to essentially explain what I'm trying to say is that the spokesman of the Chinese Foreign Ministry has also said that with the temporary ceasefire agreement still in place, the US ramped up military deployment and resorted to a targeted blockade. This will only aggravate confrontation, escalate tension, undermine the already fragile ceasefire, and further jeopardize safe passage through the Straits of Hormuz. So you get the drift of where things are going on. And when we talk about the drift, of course, we have to talk about the Straits of Hormuz. Now here I'm talking about the blockade. The US position is enforcing sanctions, protecting freedom of navigation, responding to Iranian extortion. That's the reason that they're giving for this blockade, which is being done all over this place. The blockade is happening in international waters. Under international law, a blockade without UN approval can be seen as an act of war, and intercepting neutral ships is legally questionable. This is the essential criticism on this US action of a blockade. We will talk about this legal issue shortly in the second half of the program, but as you can see, the blockade is already in place, and these are the two ships which were recorded as trying to go through the blockade, and then they were turned back. That's happening this happened recently, so that goes to show that this is actually taking shape. But there's a lot of criticism coming, and that's the real issue, that this blockade is now coming under intense scrutiny. China has, of course, said that it has criticized the blockade as escalation and is still moving some tankers. Britain says not fully backing the US, concerned about the legality and escalation, very important here. And Saudi Arabia, of course, Saudi officials have urged the US to end the blockade and the Straits of Hormuz. So piling up, pressure is piling up in many ways, and therefore I think it would be in the fitness of things to say that at the heart of this context, beyond this, is the nuclear issue, and this will become much more apparent in the days to come. This is essentially where everything is converging for Iran and for the US. Low enrichment, civilian use, high enrichment moves you towards weapons capability, and once you're near that threshold, the stakes change completely. This is why the disagreement between a 5-year and a 20-year suspension matters so much, which is what has been debated the last couple of days. Now, as in reference to what I just said, of course, one delays, the other reshapes the strategic timeline. Now, if you look at the Iranian enrichment program, these are universal enrichment thresholds which are recognized, accepted. 3 to 5% enrichment is okay for civilian use. 20% enrichment is meant for research level. 60% near weapons threshold. 90% weapons grade. So this is the category of how you measure that. The jcpoa, which is again now being talked about a lot, the agreement between the Obama administration and Iran, its baseline was enrichment capped at 3.6%, centrifuges limited to 5060 IR1 and strict stockpile limit. So this was what was already agreed upon. The Trump administration threw it out, and now we are trying to find a new agreement. Now on this issue, of course, I was talking about China. Now Russia has also jumped in, and you can see how this conflict is now getting bigger and bigger and expanding. The Russian foreign minister Sergei Lavrov has said, we will accept any decision that suits the Iranian side based on its legitimate rights. I very much hope that those directly involved in the talks, the US side in this case, will take a realistic approach, take into account the interest of the entire region, and will not continue the unprovoked aggression. Russians can't make their position more clear than this. So that's what essentially means when we talk about this conflict expanding. And that's essentially why the last round also stalled, this nuclear issue. Not because talks failed, I've been saying that repeatedly, but because the core issue remained unresolved. Now, bring in the bigger context. The previous nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which I just referred to, was built on limits in exchange for sanctions relief. That's important. But it had built-in expiry. And when the US withdrew, the entire structure collapsed. Now negotiators are not rebuilding a system. What they're trying to do is to build a new one from the wreckage of the old one. And this is where things get even more complicated. Because sanctions are not just policy, they're law. Some can be lifted easily, others are deeply embedded, which means sequencing becomes critical. In other words, who moves first, who verifies, who guarantees compliance, and then of course there's technology. Iran's centrifuge capability today is far more advanced than before. More efficiency, faster enrichment, shorter breakout time. So here's the uncomfortable truth. You can dismantle machines, you cannot erase knowledge. I mean, that's the fundamental reality. So now the choices become clearer. There are only a few possible outcomes: a return to a deal, an interim arrangement, a comprehensive agreement, or no agreement and escalation. And now this brings me back to Pakistan, because Pakistan is not just hosting talks, it is driving the process, as you can see. It's building alignments, relaying messages, pushing for outcome, not just dialogue. And that is why Islamabad matters, because if the next round happens and all signs suggest it might, it will not just be another meeting, it will be a test of whether momentum becomes resolution or collapses into escalation. And that brings us back to the core truth. Talks did not fail, they stalled. And that means the choice still exists: escalation or resolution. And here is the line that defines this moment. The closer diplomacy gets, the more dangerous escalation becomes, because pressure begins to build. And that's where we are. The pressure is building every single day, which is why we are trying to look for an off-ramp. Everybody is trying to look for an off-ramp. And in this process, the naval blockade that we have been discussing, that naval blockade is not helping matters. It is enhancing tension. It is trying to, even though it is trying to provide the United States an upper hand, it is fraught with dangers. There is a lot of information about the blockade that is relevant, and that will feed into the next segment that we are about to go into, an interview with an expert, US expert, legal expert from